So grateful for your time, Johnny, for meeting us today and talking about your chapter in Hope and Joy in Education. And we know your chapter is titled Value Creation and the Revitalization of Dependency as a Core Goal of Eco-Critical Education. And one thing that, really stood out to us about your chapter is that, as you were reading Daisaku Ikeda's work and studying about his philosophy, you mentioned that you are really reflecting on your experience as a math teacher in Detroit. I'm so sorry. And that you share these vignettes of your experience teaching, and so we were wondering how you came to really write about these stories and incorporate that into your chapter, as you share the vignettes and then you share your reflections on what you've learned. So maybe you could start off with telling us a little bit more about that.
Sure, and thank you for both of you taking time today and throughout this entire project to really engage in sort of relationship building and having dialogue aligned with the themes, not only of the book and these conversations, but truly engaging in relationship building and dialogue is such a key part. And that's really where kind of the stories emerge from is is through a relationship that I have with one of the book editors who's I've known for years, Dr. Jason Gula, and over the years of being a math teacher and a high school teacher in Detroit, and then getting a PhD and becoming a teacher educator, and those overlapping and interlocking ways, I've known Jason through almost the entire process as a friend and as I guess a little bit of a mentor and a colleague. And he always we would share stories, just like when you kind of hang out, right? Like you just meet and share stories and talk, and just in an everyday kind of way begin to build those collaborative relationships where you're learning together all the time. And so, and for me, like the learning occurred through the sharing of stories. So did the friendship development and the kind of trust. As a early kind of career academic, so much of my writing I felt needed to be formal, and so much of it, and I think there's some merit to that and some value, because there's a whole genre, right, of like what is an academic article, and I think those boundaries need to be pushed, right? And I'm certainly not the one often pushing those boundaries. So through sharing stories with Jason and taking on new reading, right, to really sort of accept his invitation, not only through our friendship, but through our academic work, to read more Ahsoka education, to read more of Ikeda's philosophy, and often a little bit of him pulling and saying, when I read your work and when we talk, I hear strands from the Lotus Sutra. I hear a lot of Buddhist principles in there, and I'm wondering, do you read these things? And I'm say honestly, like, no, but I have some experiences with Buddhist community and through some of the principles, and told some stories and shared some experiences. And so when Jason invited me to write for the project, I said, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this project. He said, no, that's exactly what this project is about. We're bringing together people who have really different ideas, but a kind of theme about their work that resonates with the work that we do with Ikeda's philosophies. And so I thought, what a wonderful opportunity. And I reached out to Jason and I said, I think the only way I feel comfortable as a novice reader of this work is to share my stories, right? Kind of that balance that we've talked about before between hubris and humility, and academia being so riddled with hubris that to take on new ideas that resonate with you and be kind of aware that they're new ideas to you, but they're not new in the world, and that they're not new to people who have studied them for a very long time and who are practicing them. I thought, why not just share some stories and begin to make sense of the experiences I had and have in my teaching through these just wonderfully warm and exciting philosophies that I'm reading now through invitations from a friend. And so that kind of led to I'm not sure how to write about this other than to share stories. And then did a little bit of that. And so that kind of led to talking about Math Party and some of the teaching in Detroit that allows for, I think, even a self level of dialogue where, writing is a transformative practice. It's a kind of conversation with the self and others, with the editors, with you, with Jason, with Isabel, like all the people kind of coming through. There's this almost asynchronous dialogue going on through the writing that I felt if I share the stories, folks can also help me be a learner and not misinterpret, appropriate, or assume knowing in a new area of growth for my own sort of thinking and practice. And so it was really thoughtful. And then I got to share that process with students of saying, I feel like when we're engaged in work this way, we're really living up to that learners leading learners moment where we're together through dialogues. We're always generatively sharing ideas and growing. And so through growth, I felt like the themes of the book really came alive in practice, right? Like we asked questions about like, what does it mean to have hope? And I'm able to be in practice in a really difficult time for most folks, be in practice of what do relationships that generate hope look like?
Thank you so much, Johnny. I love that. Like just the whole, the process of really being able to have internal dialogue and then dialogue, to talk about the chapter and really bring that forward. And I know, Mitch, you unmuted if you.
In those stories, Johnny, you showed how even though you were intentionally seeing yourself as a peace educator, through reflection, you came to see that actually your mode of being in the classroom wasn't perhaps conducive to peace in the deepest sense, in the sense of what you've just been talking about of relationships and overall awareness. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, we talk about humility. That's still one of the most humbling moments to have, is to be sort of self-aware of both practicing not only talking the talk but walking the walk. And when we begin to look at the complexities around peace, right? Peace is not passivity. Peace isn't just a list of rules, right? And so when teaching for peace, and in particular aligning with hope for peace and wanting to have a classroom, we'll say, that is not only warm and welcoming to students but also challenging, right? And to find that balance, that challenging doesn't mean to be making students feel uncomfortable, unnecessarily unsafe, right? We need our boundaries to push a little bit. We need to grow, but in ways where we are genuinely supported and valued. And so in constant navigation of how to steward those spaces, right? How to have classrooms or learning environments or even communities or homes or neighborhoods that embody those ideals, right? Early in my career, and I still work on it all the time, right? But early in my career, I just went in with all the energy, just like really embodying that sort of idea that good teaching meant big, boisterous, like up on top of the desk excitement. And some of that is important if it's authentic and genuine and thoughtful and not, embodying the kind of maybe violence that a particular community may be triggered by, right? And that can happen anywhere in any classroom. We don't know the kinds of experiences that young people or even peers at any age bring to the spaces we're in. So in the chapter, but also as my career grew through friendships, right? Through relationships of educators and other people who it would be under giving them credit to say that they are thoughtful about their education practices. They are deeply intentional, right, and attentive to the diversity of learners in their classrooms. And so those kinds of teachers that I were able to work with over the years helped me to see that learning and listening to all the living beings that you're sharing space with is a day-to-day, moment-to-moment practice that is key to being, I think, a really good educator. And so none of us just like snap our fingers and become great teachers. But we have sometimes an image of what a great teacher looks like. And we emulate that, or we step into those roles, no matter how authentic it might feel, right? I feel totally well and at myself with big energy in the classroom. But I'm not the only one in the classroom. And so finding that balance and taking that time to learn about all the living things in that space, right? All of the human learners, but all of the life present that's supporting that human living, and really honoring and valuing it, and thinking about how might we teach and learn together in this space in a way that not only does the least amount of harm, but that kind of finds that balance between making sure everyone is honored, welcome, and comfortably safe, and then just enough uncomfortable to learn something new, or to share, or to be vulnerable or present in the learning moment. And I think that's a tough thing sometimes right now that's often polarized for teachers, right? Is we have a strong political discourse right now in media that children should not be uncomfortable. And this is sort of a twist on human rights, right? Human rights are absolutely important. Children's rights are absolutely, I think, a key text for any teacher or anyone working with children or even around children in our community to understand and honor children's rights. But children's rights don't mean that sometimes we don't, with safety, be uncomfortable a little bit to grow. And so there's a discourse right now that says teachers are teaching content or material that will make students feel uncomfortable, right? And we got to unpack that and defend teachers a little bit and say, well, hold on, because really good teachers hold space for safe learning, anchored in children's rights and recognizing and valuing young people as learners, as humans, as members of the diverse species in our community, and honoring that. And part of honoring that is teaching, and is so bringing them into knowing in a way, or being present at the birth of new ideas for them that sometimes feels a little bit uncomfortable, or a little bit like stepping outside of one's comfort zones to learn and grow. And so that kind of is a helpful, I think, twist to some of this right now, is that we're in incredibly difficult times. That is probably true for most of history, that we can find difficulty in life and struggle, but the amount of shared grief right now across our global communities for a myriad of reasons. I was sort of invigorated by the conversations of not only the book, but our meetings, because I think it resonates with this idea that hope generates hope, right? And that when we build relationships together and start to tease apart some of these complexities of, can we hold comfortable, can we teach for peace and find balance, that teaching for peace doesn't always mean fighting, right? And if our practices model kind of that energy or that aggression that we're often familiar with when we come up through fight, that we may be in fact antithetical to our goal in teaching for peace. And so there's that balance of, like, in the chapter we talk about, well, math party's kind of fun, and it's important that math is fun, but there's got to be a balance and a recognition to that kind of energy, and just to the practice of what is it like to be calm and present in the chaos, and not just kind of chaotic in the chaos. And how does one move through learning spaces, which should be kind of messy, right? Diverse learners and energies going all over the place, and whatever kinds of traumas and experiences people bring to that. But then a teacher, being a person who can read, listen, respond, and help kind of orchestrate or curate some bringing to a balance. And sometimes it's a messy balance, but bringing to a balance how we share space together and learn. And I would say for majority of the beginning of my teaching career, the models I had, or at least that I had affinity towards as a young teacher, were superhero teachers. And certainly there's some brilliance in what they do, but it's also unsustainable. It's also anchored in some very, culturally dominant practices that don't actually cultivate the kind of learners we want to sustain in our communities. I felt like it contributed to competition, to constant like raising the level of intensity. And for young people, some of that I think is really important, but I think there's this balance. And then also for our own energy levels as teachers, right? One of those real aha moments for me through relationships with people who I think some were the Buddhists who came and observed, and we read about that in the chapter, right? Who were like, you're not teaching for peace. You're talking about peace, but this is the opposite of peace in here. It's loud. And I think there's a balance, because my friend who visited was right in his observation, but also there can be joy and balance in some of that energy. It just really needs to be intentional and thoughtful and responsive to the energies of the people in that place. And so there's this dance that I think not only comes with experience, but with practice of teaching as a craft or a set of practices and less of a science, right? It's really a learning to listen and respond to and bring content learning to those moments where we're in resonance with one another in a learning space. So those are the kinds of things I think where my unlearning what good teaching looked like, and certainly that's snapshots. But then thinking, well, what does it look like? And what does it feel like? And what does it sound like? And what do students' responses to different kinds of teaching bring?
This reminded me of something we've touched on in earlier conversations, where you talked about how did you put it? The learners leading learners model. It seems like in a classroom, or probably in all of life, we're always switching our roles. Sometimes we're a teacher, sometimes we're a leader. And this is something Cynthia Dillard talked about in her foreword to the book. How's this played out for you in your teaching and your experience?
Well, I mean, I will say I'm grateful to be part of a wonderful team of teacher educators and researchers at Washington State, which is connected to Dr. Dillard in historical ways. But the mission statement, or kind of our guiding diagram that we have, is centered around a Venn diagram, which as a mathematician and math teacher, that resonated well with me. But there were three interlocking circles that came early from kind of a curriculum planning and strategic idea sharing of the faculty in the College of Education at Washington State when I first got there. And there was something about being there that pulled me from Detroit and brought me to the inland Pacific Northwest, because that was really not my plan. And it has to do with folks who were building together in a way around ideas of partnering with diverse communities for social justice and sustainability as a core sort of organizing principle or line of inquiry for all of our teaching and for all of the work we do in education research. And I thought, this is a moment where I would like to be part of that kind of thing. And so to experience that in the job interview process helped really me discern with my community if it was the right idea to move so far from my natal soil, right? And so being that transplant here, one of the diagrams that we accompanied that mission statement with this was a Venn diagram that had learners in one circle, leaders in another circle, and learning in the other circle. And it came out of these dialogues together, very different education researchers, very different philosophies of education, but this kind of weaving conversations around what were the primary identities we brought with us to our work. And so those three really resonate with me, and I have them on a poster in all the classrooms that I teach in my office and on my desk when I'm writing, because I'm thinking about communicating an audience in the work that we do. How are we, in a practice of one's humility, always remembering that I'm a learner, but I have responsibility as a leader, and that I'm learning too. So I'm learners leading learners. I have students, right? I have leadership responsibilities. I'm also learning. I don't know everything. Even if I have letters after the end of my name, or I've read many books and I can spar with philosophical arguments or do those kinds of like academic practices. I sometimes call them bad habits or, addictions of academia, but none of that is absolute. We know this. And so even the experts are not experts, but they know some things, and they have a responsibility to teach and share openly, and also to grow and to listen and to be responsive and to adjust and adapt and rethink things. And so I like those three: learners leading learners kind of became a phrase in my teaching, a mantra we might say, in the education practice, to say, is this piece embodying learners leading learners? Or is it taking on the hubris of guy who thinks he knows everything telling other people? And I found that that's kind of a helpful lens when we're also unpacking tough moments or difficult content in classrooms. When we're talking about how are we going to teach about this really important moment, the largest social uprising of all of our lives here. We have Black Lives Matter movement occurring, climate change activism around the world, just incredible moment with a lot of political tension here where we're teaching. And so teachers are really nervous sometimes to discuss it and to center it around, to already have a practice of where learners leading learners. We can't sidestep this one. No matter what our politics are or what our beliefs or affinities are, whether we identify as social justice educators or environmental justice educators, however we identify, this is happening in our community, and we are leaders, but we are a special kind of leader. We're learners leading learners. And so it helps center us together in a less hierarchical way. That's another big thing, I think, coming from sort of some of the philosophies that I'm reading now that you all are sharing, but resonating with my sort of anarchist studies around how do we really think about community that doesn't assume value hierarchies that mimic authoritarianism, right? That start to become like small dictatorships enacted instead of democracies, that become more punitive, less disciplined. And so how do we begin to think about teaching and learning in ways that value and honor discipline, but that don't assume discipline means punishment, that don't assume that teacher means dictator of the classroom, right? That we truly embrace in the messiness of what it means to engage in democratic education. Or for me, sometimes I'm like, it's sort of an anarchist. Maybe even we're venturing into maybe a more Buddhist infused sort of learning space, but one that helps the teacher maintain their responsibilities and have those front and center for themselves. They don't get lost in that idea that the children are also equal learners in that space. Their lives matter, each and every one of them, and the teacher's included in that. So there's sort of a horizontal reminding ourselves of the space we're sharing together, and to push it a bit with the teachers I work with, to think about that beyond human even. the kind of humanist ideas we have might be a little bit off and centered on human in a particular way that doesn't include or recognize our interdependencies and the multiple species that contribute to our well-being and even our suffering in the spaces that we're in. So thinking about learners leading learners as a kind of easy mantra that always gives us a practice to come back to say, well, who are the learners? Who's responsible for leading? What does that leading look like? Right? As a learner, what does it need to be? Certainly sometimes it needs to be more firm. We talk about empathetic but firm teaching. We talk about teaching with compassion, right? It doesn't mean anything goes in the classroom because we're learners leading learners, but it means we might adjust because we might learn something new about a student or about a content area that requires adjustment. And that's in that dynamic of the relationship. And so that's where that phrase kind of just built from and sort of echoes and amplifies dialogue around what does it mean to teach for social justice? What does it mean to struggle as a peace educator? To grapple with the tendency we might have as educators in this culture to have a list of facts and bring them in with a lot of energy and exciting strategies for how young people can embody those facts and take them out into the world. And it's far more complex than that. And so when we get into that complexity, what does it look like, feel like, sound like, smell like, and what are the outcomes that help us to be learners leading learners?
You know, when just a moment ago, you mentioned that you need to be able to adjust in the middle of the flow. And I learned here years ago when we were working on Dewey, the great Dewey book, Living is Learning, with Jim Garrison, Larry Hickman, and Daisaku Ikeda, that's actually the phrase that Dewey used was adjustment. And this is how he negotiated means and ends. So we have our end in view. It could be a facet of social justice. It could be a particular classroom that we've envisioned. But we have to keep checking in to see if the means we're using are actually getting us toward that goal we wanted. So it seems like what I'm hearing you say is that if the teacher's fully responsive to the moment, that helps them negotiate where they are, perhaps in the hierarchy, or who's leading and how they're leading at a given time. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, and it's something that we have to learn to do and practice. And I think it's sometimes the unspoken lessons in learning to teach is that it looks different for each of us. So you really have to find it within and find authentic, healthy ways of being around young people that help you as the teacher, and we're very different, all of us, you as the teacher be able to be in that flow, be able to be present in those moments so that it's like a heightened senses, right? If I have to, sometimes when I talk to students about it, I'm like, have you seen Spider-Man? The Spidey senses go on. So you kind of heighten senses for the needs of the learners in the classroom. And it's overwhelming and it's loud and it's a lot in the beginning because it's opening up to the diversity, to the rich boon of different ways we are in the classroom. It's easier to just see a bunch of kids and say they're all third grade reading level and they all will like a few of these ways that we do things differently. And that's not me even picking on teachers right now. I think teachers do a pretty good job in a lot of spaces of making sure there are multiple ways students are learning things. But it's that practice when you begin to open up your senses to the diversity of ways that young people are engaged. And you begin to read the differences between compliance and engagement. And compliance is silent. It's very neat. It's very calm in a sense, but the energy is not. there's almost this like screaming, banging behind the doors. And then when we move from compliance to engagement and we're attuned to it, it's loud and you hear all of the rich, wonderful things. I sometimes say if you go to like a meadow, right, at dusk, and you hear all of the bugs and you hear all of the birds that are still out, but you also start to hear all of the bustle of the different species in that place, right? Or you go to a busy, well, now we have earbuds and things, but I would say like you go to the subway or you go to a busy place where there's talking and there's all, you hear the rich boon of diversity, and you go into a classroom and, right? And so when you attune to diversity of classroom, there's a loudness, there is a messiness that can be overwhelming, and the quick response is, go back, get them under control. And so constantly navigating with new teachers and even expert teachers, we all talk about I say school seeps in. We start to tend towards get compliance back in place because it's loud, it's a lot of work, it's energy engaging. And that's a different kind of work that requires discipline and practice both at the job and outside the job. We want to be healthy because that's exhausting, right? That's a lot of being on in a particular way. And so when we begin to open to what does engagement look like, we're inviting all these diverse learners, sometimes 30 some plus ourselves and aides and all the people who move through and whatever, hopefully diverse species we have in the classroom as well. Then all of a sudden now we have all of these noises per se going on, and we begin to figure out how do we respond to them, move, and begin to shape them. And the metaphor I often use with students is, I don't think when I see the orchestra, I don't think that I see the conductor as a dictator. I think I see the conductor, and I might be wrong, but I see the conductor as being able to kind of help the excellent cornucopia of sounds come together to make this beautiful noise. And so I think the same way about teaching when I'm trying to draw on a metaphor to visualize it for new teachers or people who are finding the courage to move from compliance to engagement, and saying like, it's gonna sound like all the noises of the orchestra going at once, until you begin to find the flow as the teacher that helps to bring each sound to the front, to the back, to share, to move together. And so that's an art, that's a craft. We practice it because it doesn't, despite what many might argue, I don't believe that it just comes naturally. I think we have capacity for it, that's in our nature, but we cultivate it and we help one another do it, and we all do it differently, which is what makes it really hard. The way that I balance engagement in classrooms might look really different than the way each of you do, and that's important. That's part of the key to the diversity of educators our students deserve and need to have. Otherwise, they're going to think all teachers are robots that do engagement like Johnny, and that's not true. And then we can't sustain that as teachers, right? Because we can't be healthy not being our authentic selves. So I think, Mitch, you brought this up too in one of our past conversations. I've really been thinking about it for a few weeks, and you brought up self-trust. Because I've been reading more about this, because I think that's, in my teaching, I think that's a key piece, because students will always ask, but how do I find myself? Talk about it looks different, and I want to look like you, or I want to look like, this person I'm observing that's one of my teachers, and she's so great at this. And so I've been thinking like, but it only really works well when you found yourself. And we're always learners leading learners, so we're adjusting and growing. But that self-trust concept and giving oneself grace, that it's not selfish to take time to develop one's self-trust. Because it's through that development of that self-trust, I feel like difficult tasks like teaching aligned with children's rights, teaching peace in peaceful ways, right? Finding humility when the tendency is hubris, or teaching not as a dictator, but as a conductor of the orchestra, requires knowing of oneself in relationship to others. And so without that peace, it gets to be really hard and maybe even impossible. And so I was wondering about demystifying that pathway, because as I talk to more teachers who have that practice, I see that commonality as they teach differently, but they have not hubris, but self-trust and confidence in who they are. And that, I think, has helped me maybe in thinking about how to teach young teachers or newer teachers. I don't mean young by age, but ones maybe even who have taught for a while, who are saying, I want to move from compliance to engagement, and I want to do so responsibly. I'm not quite sure. And I think that's a huge, courageous moment. It's brave, because so I've been pretty good at following a recipe or a script, but I'm pretty sure it's not the one I want to be following. And so how do I not throw the baby out with the bathwater and responsibly be a different kind of educator? And I think that key piece, I'm really interested in learning more about how different educators, or even different learners leading learners in our communities, cultivate and tend to their development of self-trust.
That was, yeah, that was really wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Johnny. It was a lot I'm thinking about now. One aspect, you really shared about how bringing forth the best in each of your students is definitely a task where you really have to think about so much going on and really figuring out, how to balance everything. And one theme that has come up in other conversations recently is, how do you, in the midst of, this year where so many the pandemic and social justice issues have come up, how do you really take care of yourself to not be kind of, I think, bogged down by all of the things that we have to kind of navigate? But as an educator, how do you also take care of yourself so that you can really work on knowing yourself and that self-trust part that you speak of? Yeah, maybe could you share a little bit about how do you do that for yourself?
Sure. It would be completely disingenuous or dishonest for me to say that I do it well. I don't know that. I think some of us do. I don't know that I do, or many of the folks who may appear to be doing it well do it all that well. But I think just that we're open to knowing, and I think that's been the biggest key for me, especially in these times, is to knowing that it's okay to not be okay. And we are all in a big growth moment, a major one. And that hope doesn't go away just because pain is present. That joy is possible to cultivate. It might be digging deep down, and it's not really joy if it's not authentic. And so pushing that might not be right. I hate the phrase, because again, remember, math party in the chapter, and I've got a lot of energy, so I've got tension with the phrase sit with it. But sometimes I maybe dance with it, or hang out with, right? Or have a cup of coffee with, that these are really tough times. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of loss. It's very real. It's okay to be with that pain. And we don't have to be perfect about it. We can share our emotions, right? And we can grow together. So I think that kind of honesty with self, when we're faced with so much suffering all around us, individually and collectively, that hope is not lost, because it's something that we can cultivate. But it might mean we have to stay with the discomfort a bit. And so I think partly, and I hate to say it because it's sometimes my nemesis in the world, is accepting that you can't just will away pain or grief or loss. And collectively as a culture, we are in a major grief moment, right? And that's not new, but it is pretty epic scale right now. And it's not even likely that it's relegated to us only as a species. And so, again, the kind of noise that opens up when you go from compliance to engagement in the classroom with students, the same for self. When you begin to say, how do I care for oneself and community together in balance in a time when we're feeling tremendous pain and loss? And so, I mean, I'm not great at it. There's a formula I'm always like talking with students about is make sure you sleep, make sure you eat, make sure you find a practice of something that might be meditative in a way. It could be walking, it could be, daydreaming. We might sometimes feel like is being lazy, but it's absolutely not, because it's recharging our capacity to cultivate hope and joy in a time where it might be really hard to feel those things. And then I have to say it to myself, because the tendency, at least in the culture I was, kind of the culture I came into teaching in and came into my identity, was just lean into it a little harder. Just get to work, because when we go to work, things get done. And I believe that's still true, but the work needs to look a little bit different and have some breathing moments. Literally, some breathing moments. In a culture, and I speak for myself when I say I'm not that great at it, in a culture where being out of breath was the measure of success. And that's a killing system. And so in a living system, it would be like, what would it be like to take regenerative breaths, to stay with or hang out with that joy is possible, even if there's moments that don't have joy in them, right? And then what do we do to begin to cultivate hope and joy authentically? And it might be like slow, right? It might be like I put the seed in there and I'm tending to the seed, but it's far from flower, right? But there's work and practice and discipline that goes into that, and patience. And so that's been a big thing for me in self-care, is being like, there's, the quote, the Bertolt Brecht quote, will there be singing in dark times? Sure, there'll be singing about dark times. But then layering in that a little bit, infusing in there with intention and attention to that we can cultivate joy and hope authentically together when we courageously stay with and hang out the moment we're in. It's teaching us something, right? So I think that's the thing. Not well, but in that process, in the mess of it. And that's what I think the best some of us can do. And the learners leading learners moment is like, we have maybe leadership on pause and sustain, and we're really sitting in the learners with like that part of the Venn diagram. Let's be open to all the things that are happening around us and not too swift to response.
We've talked about self-trust, and now we've talked about self-care.
Mm-hmm.
And this relates to, Mr. Ikeda's core notion of human revolution, that a change in a single individual can affect the destiny of humankind. So in a way, it's a valuing of the self, but I don't think it's a valuing of self over collective.
Mm-hmm.
I think it means self as starting point, because this is the most concrete aspect of your life. And then for me, the relationship to the collective is then one of radiating out in greater circles. How would you see the relationship between the individual and the collective?
Yeah, Mitch, I love that you bring this up, because I think my own self, I've struggled quite a bit with that dichotomy of selfless or selfish. And care for the self meant to neglect the collective. And I think we know ourselves. I'm speak for being like deeply embedded in Western industrial kind of culture. We come to know ourselves as singularities. And this is a false premise that sets us up for a lot of failure in a sense. And I don't want to like not failure or success, but I think a lot of misunderstanding of oneself is that we have our individuality and our diversity amongst us, but that we are inextricable from one another and from the systems we're in. And so I think there is a coupling of with self-learning and self-trust as a sort of unlearning that autonomous individual kind of false notion of your existence is separate from and in competition with everybody else. This is just simply a cultural crisis and not a phenomenon of human nature, right? And so I think that's a big piece of it. So understanding of self in connection with community. And I love this concept. You both can help me because in reading, I don't know how to pronounce it, but creative coexistence, which has a word that doesn't directly translate to English, except for I love creative coexistence. This term, this concept.
Yeah. We would have to get Jay on the call. He knows, he's the expert there, but certainly Jay has identified creative coexistence as key.
Yes, this for me has through my studies with Jason and through really thinking about this idea of like creative coexistence. One, I have affinity towards creativity. I love this notion of like it's not anything goes, but these possibilities are endless. And the responsibility of with creativity, what do we do with it? The human capacity to be creative and adaptive. But what are our shared ethics around that? And what are our responsibilities? And how do we creatively coexist? And for me, that's a big piece of that practice of like self in relationship to community through creative coexistence. How are we cultivating that? It's not anything goes. It's not about me, but it's about that I can be part of something the best way possible, the healthiest, balanced, most balanced way possible, if I'm attentive to myself and where I fit in and contribute to that greater collective, where I see myself as part of that greater collective. And that's beyond just thinking about human species, right? That's thinking about the air we breathe, the water that we are majority water, right? So beginning to think of ourselves, of the self, as a body of water. How does that change one's connection to creative coexistence? We are bodies of water moving around, sharing. What comes in goes out, and we are like diverse things are moving through us. There is a relational intimacy with what we put into our bodies and with what we share and prepare in foods and drink and in our physical spaces with one another. And so how do we begin to honor and recognize our creative coexistence requires attention to the collective and the self in that dance. So I have loved that in the studies that are in the Ikeda work, because it's helped me begin to put some different concepts to the limiting language that I had for these things, which was always this: why are we focused on independence when we are all dependent? And I really got for a big chunk, and still in my studies, I'm really focused on really wanting to understand this tension between independence and dependence, and this negative stigma to dependence, to a dependency that is culturally, constructed, and this success on independence when the independence is absolutely false, right? It's an illusion of independence. Certainly there's some successes and some wonderful things that are celebrated in people's individualities that mirror or get labeled as independent. And I love this notion of beginning to think about interdependences, moving away from that dichotomy of it's independence or dependency, and that there's a balance, because it helps us better understand the unhealthy ways codependency may be unhealthy, the ways that extreme independence might be not acknowledging one's dependencies, as I've put it before. But I love this notion of interrelationship, of interdependency, and really that creative coexistence between self and collective, and they kind of overlap and move back and forth. So those, I think, are really helpful. And then I just wonder, this is throwing it way out, but it popped into my head as we were talking. When we've been faced with so much adversity in I'd say the last decade, but especially the last few years, it's been culminating, like really boiling over to a moment. And we're in that moment. And the imagery we have for future is really dystopic, is really, really this coming doom. But yet, all of the stories that we have for our human capacity to recalibrate towards the collective, to anchor into mutual aid, tell a different story. And so I've been really thinking about that notion of how do we tap into hope and think about sharing stories of communities who have been faced with extreme adversity, who are hanging out with the pain, who are tapping into their really ancestral knowledges around how to be together in community. And we see the human response is very different than the dystopic images that we're constantly seeing and that we might be mimicking in some ways. And so I wonder if like what we might begin to do, and that's what I'm thinking about, is sharing stories of hope that are anchored in here's what communities and really going beyond human communities. So looking at mycelial networks, looking at, salmon populations who have been through extreme adversity on the planet, but seeing stories of hope in that and finding sort of resonance and commonality, and that maybe as humans we have more capacity for creative coexistence than we're giving it. And I come back to it because I love that notion. It's got to be creative because we have a script before us that makes us rightfully so feel pretty uneasy. And so what's our capacity for creativity to be with one another in healthy, peaceful ways? And so I think that's kind of where I've been like, ooh, in that moment, like what's out there? There's some great stories. There's some really wonderful learners leading learner moments where human communities have just done, like we would call it, miraculous things. But maybe that's what we do together as in communities. We adapt and we adjust and we find ways to creatively coexist.
Yes, that reminds me actually of the Into Full Flower, the book with Elise Boulding and Daisaku Ikeda. And I think the idea that in peace building, we always have to be able to imagine a world that is different from what we're living in now, and to not give up on that hope and be able to, if we can envision it. I think Elise Boulding said this, if we can envision it, then we can, work towards it. And so that I love the idea of really learning from others and what they're doing, so that it kind of helps to expand collectively each of our kind of visions to what is possible and what we can work towards. And it also reminds me of this quote that you have in your chapter about how, hope can sometimes become like just a marketing slogan for change, but then you say like, I have great hope, but it is hope that is closely coupled with action. So being able to envision something and work and take action towards it allows us to move forward together. So that really inspired me. And yeah, I know we're coming close to the hour, but is there anything that, anything else you would like to add that we weren't able to cover right now, or any like final thoughts that you have?
No, any that you have?
I know you touched a little bit about, how you yourself, keep tapping into that hope and the joy that in your day to day, how do you really keep hope and joy alive in your work?
Mm-hmm. So for me, and it was through relationship with you all, because I remember I said part of the practice right now is to hang out with the difficulty for hope, right? But not let go of it, right? Because it is a generative force. And I can't remember the concept. Maybe it was a direct concept in one of our conversations together, but I do remember having a moment of like real clarity from our conversation around that some of us do generate hope. Some of us do that. Like it grows from us. Like and that doesn't make us better or more valuable in community. It just genuinely emanates from our authentic selves, right? We just have a tendency. And I think that doesn't negate or devalue that might not be where others identify and their contributions. But I had been in my own self practice and thinking, it's like, how truthful with myself am I being? Is my hope and joy genuine, or is it a protection from staying with or being in this suffering moment or growing? And in our conversations and in thinking about it, I don't remember if there was a direct concept or not of it, but there was this idea that you move through the world and you become sort of like a catalyst for hope. And and I think this is true for a lot of teachers. You draw out, like the knowledge is in there, but you're present at the birth of new ideas and connections all the time. And that in community, some of us have that energy, that we really are present for the joy sharing. And maybe it's the flint, the spark, the fires, right? That there are people who are there lighting the fires. And so carrying the fire of hope and joy around in community and being okay with that. And I was at a moment a couple months ago where I wasn't sure it was responsible to light fires. I didn't know. I was thinking maybe those are damaging fires. Maybe those aren't the right fires. Maybe that's giving false hope. Maybe it's clinging to inspiration where things need to just be left alone. And so I think that's part of my own thing, was saying, no, like we have those people and it's okay to be those people. And sometimes we need those people. And so finding those spaces where it's okay to light fires and being part of that catalyst, like let's ignite hope and joy in ways that are deeply coupled with action and with community. Because even in the toughest times, and I don't want to romanticize it, right? But hope and joy are there, right? And so maybe some of us are that kind of warrior, because I'm a fighter, right? Like I talk about my tensions with peace, education, and my affinity towards fight. But begin to say, like, what does the fight look like when the battle is keeping the fire and sharing it, keeping the hope and joy and sharing it, keeping that, tending to that fire, right? Put in a coal and making sure it stays warm and burning and not out of control raging, right? There's a fire, pass it on, share it, but don't give it all, right? Because take it to other parts. So really coming into that identity, I think, has helped a lot too. Because while you sit and hang out with the great pain and suffering, you realize that there is work to do. And it can be sharing hope and joy. It can be being a catalyst for the hope and joy that others may not have right now. Or maybe their flame is getting really dying out and you say, hey, let me pass you some flame. So that's been a really big, through this relationship, through the work, through the readings, but a really big moment of my own like self-identity is saying, okay, I think there's a balance here. And there's not just purpose, but meaning and purpose to sharing hope.
I would say, Johnny, listening to you talk now, it reminds me that when I was checking in with others about our original dialogue we had to talk about this, I said to someone, I said, well, Johnny he's nothing if not sincere, and he wears his heart on his sleeve. And I'm like, you know what? That's really energizing. And it's being cynical is not being more realistic. I think that's what we would say here. Being idealistic and sincere is just as realistic as what we might call the opposite. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mitch and Anri.